Excellent. Okay, so here I am again at 6 o'clock my time, opening the show. Very happy to be back. Excuse me if I speak slowly on occasion because I'm a bit jet lagged. I'm going to be talking about Ruby on Rails Insurgency. Insurgency is kind of a harsh word to use when you're talking about technology. For those that don't know, it means staging a rebellion against an existing government. And so why would we be talking about that now? Why would we be doing an insurgency with Ruby on Rails? What does that even mean? Well, we have an existing government or an existing ruling body right now, and that is the status quo of how software is done here in Brazil. And worldwide, of course, as well. We choose to fight against that, and I think we can say we here because you're all here at this Rails Summit. Rails and Ruby and the Ruby way of doing things are not established here in Brazil yet. So why is it worth fighting to get a technology adopted? It seems kind of weird. It's just programming, right? Well, in the United States, at least, and I don't have statistic for Brazil, but I would guess it's similar. In the United States, the Bureau of Labor Statistics did a study that shows that the typical American spends 53% of their waking time working. So that means the typical American spends over half of their life as an adult working. So why is it important to fight to do things the way that you want to do them? To do things the way you know are right. I recently saw a keynote by Gary Vaynerchuk, who is from Wine Library TV. And I think he said it best. Gary Vaynerchuk kind of uses bad language and screams a lot. But here's what he said. You can blame him for what I'm about to say. He said, "Too many of you every day are doing shit that you know is wrong, that you hate. Too many of you are doing that every day. You're smart people, you're passionate people. Stop doing that. Stop wasting your time. Stop doing things that you know are wrong. Don't go and put yourself in a prison of mediocrity day after day after day." Passion is a resource that we all have available to us. And if you're here, you probably have more than the average developer. But passion is something that you need to conserve. I have learned the hard way over time that passion is something you can run out of. And when you run out of it, it slows you down. It makes you worse as a developer, worse as an employee. It makes you provide less value for the people that you're working for. And if you're doing that during 53% of your waking time on average, and I would say software developers, it's probably more like 60, 65, 70% of your waking time, then you're basically just running yourself dry and slowing down and making your life more miserable. So that's why it's worth fighting. And that's why we use terms like insurgency to describe the attempt to have technologies and practices adopted in our workplaces that we think are sane. So a little bit of history. I was one of the organizers of the first ever Ruby conference, RubyConf 2001. At that conference, we had 34 attendees. Let's see, I have some notes on numbers here. 5 of those attendees, of the 34, were original authors of the Agile Manifesto. So you know the Agile Manifesto? Who knows that? Yeah? So 5 of them out of 34. Imagine if that percentage of the audience here were people like that, right? And we had at least 8 well-known authors at the time. People whose books I had read and been strongly influenced by. So we had this real core group of thought leaders, really intelligent people that showed up to talk about Ruby for 3 days. They came from all over the world. And the interesting thing about that is that at RubyConf 2001, 0 of the attendees were getting paid to do Ruby. And that was just 8 years ago. And that was the International Ruby Conference. Now, how many of you get paid to do Ruby and or Rails today? That's pretty incredible. I'm guessing that a large percentage of the rest of you would like to get paid to do it, right? How many of you would like to get paid to do it but don't? And the rest of you, I don't know why you're here. So. Okay. Also at RubyConf 2001, I'm going to talk about a couple of presentations that occurred there. The first one, the opening keynote, was by Dave Thomas. Dave Thomas is the original author of Programming Ruby, along with Andy Hunt from the Pragmatic Programmers. Dave's keynote, he said that we were all, by virtue of being there, pioneers. And it was really kind of rousing. You know, a pioneer is someone who explores new territory, stakes a claim to it, pushes the boundaries of their civilization, of their reach. And it was very inspirational to us because we realized we really were pioneers. It was clear that because of the concentration of smart, influential people in that room, that it wasn't just some nerdy technology we were all playing with. You know, those kinds of people don't show up just to play with some nerdy technology. We were obviously doing something important. We were on the bleeding edge of something important. Now that was in 2001. Things have obviously changed a lot. There was no such thing as Rails then. I think David Hansen was still, you know, in grade school riding skateboards and that sort of thing in 2001. I'm talking about this now, though, because even though we were pioneers back then in Ruby, that was in the United States. And technology travels slowly from continent to continent. So for the same reason that we were pioneers then, you are all pioneers now. You're staking new claims to territory. You're pushing this dynamic language thing forward. You're probably also pushing agile software development forward because Ruby and Rails and agile software development kind of go together. You are those pioneers just like we were back then, but you're doing it here in Latin America. So also at RubyConf 2001, Andy Hunt, the co-author then of Programming Ruby and Pragmatic Programmer, did a presentation called Rails Insurgency. And so yes, I stole the idea for this talk and the title and a great deal of the content from Andy Hunt. Just get that out of the way. What Andy said there still very much applies, even in the United States. I think a lot of us that were there from the early days of Ruby and Rails forget that even though for us Ruby is now old news, for much of the population, even in the US, it's still bleeding edge. It's still pioneering, and people still have not moved forward, right? So what Andy said was, we are creating this insurgency to attack the fortress of corporate IT. And this kind of idea probably is familiar to you if you've worked in a big enterprise shop, and I think most of you here in Latin America do. You work in big companies, right? So IT is set up like a fortress. It has guards, and the guards protect the corporate assets. That's their job. And by protect the corporate assets, what does that really mean? That means they stop you from changing things. Because if you change things, then they can't guarantee that they're going to work, right? So they're the ones that stop you from using a new database or a new programming language. And you know, they use all kinds of techniques to stop you from doing it. And as Andy said, there is a fiefdom devoted to tools, languages, methodologies, etc. Anything that seems important. Only the important things, though, are what these trolls are guarding. So, who are the trolls? You know them, right? Some of you might actually be some of these trolls, I'm not sure. But they're people like me. I actually come from a big corporate IT background. I was director of software engineering at one company. I was head of application architecture globally at one of the largest companies in the world. And when I did that, it was actually my job to initially set standards, but then to defend them. So in a way, I'm here to provide a perspective of someone who has been like this so that I can show you what it is that they're thinking. They're not idiots, arguably, but you know, they have good intentions, but they're good intentions that have gone awry. So I'm one of those guards, as I said. My job was to stop people from changing the things that I knew worked. You know, but why do these trolls do what they do? Why are they guarding, and why are they trying to stop you from changing? Well, I think in a lot of cases, from what I've seen and from my own personal experience, the reason that they guard against change is because at one point they were just like us here. They were sitting at a brink, at the point where something needed to change. They were looking at people doing it the old, wrong way. You know, people doing waterfall processes and all the kind of stuff that we hate today. They knew there was a better way, and they were that person in the organization that was always pushing to change it. So they got used to fighting and defending their ideas and attacking everyone and being attacked, right? It made them very defensive. They actually did put something into place, finally, that worked. They won. They won that fight, just like we want to win the fight. But after they won it, they experienced something that is called value rigidity. So the concept of value rigidity comes from, at least the term, comes from a book called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Have any of you read this book? A few of you have, great. It's one of my favorite books that I've ever read, and it applies to just about everything I ever do, turns out. But this is my favorite story from Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Robert Pirsig, in the book, tells the story of how people in South India trapped monkeys. And this is a macaque from South India. I actually lived in South India for a while, so I'm very familiar with the nasty macaque. Macaques are mischievous little devils. Whenever you see them in public, if you're holding food, they're notorious for just running 1,000,000 miles per hour behind you and grabbing the food and running off. So people don't like the macaques very much. They scare you, they're mean. They kind of come in gangs and will intimidate you into dropping your bananas, that kind of thing. So what the people of South India apparently did, I've never actually seen this happen, fortunately, is to stop these macaques from doing what they did, they would drill holes in the ground, and at the bottom they would hollow the hole out. So it's kind of a long, slender hole with a bulb at the bottom. And then they would pour rice down into the hole. Now, the macaques always want food. That's why they're so annoying anyway, right? So what the macaques would do is they would squeeze their hand down into the hole, they would feel the rice, and then they would clutch the rice like this. And so they get a big handful of rice down in that bigger area at the bottom of the hole, and then the South Indian people would come out with their clubs or whatever. Now the macaque sees them coming, starts screaming like a monkey can, but they won't let go of the rice. That's value rigidity. They want that food so much that they don't realize they're going to get beaten to death instead of getting the food. So, who are the trolls? They're people like you, potentially, in the future. After you succeed in the Ruby on Rails insurgency, you have to be really careful not to be the one that establishes that value rigidity. Okay. So, how do trolls attack you? How do they defend? Well, they use fear, uncertainty, and doubt. So we're going to talk about some of the FUD techniques that they use to defend the corporate fortress. So here's the first one. This will come out right from the get-go. But does it scale? You say all this great stuff about Ruby on Rails, but does it scale? Can you actually run a real site on it, or is it just a toy? And unfortunately, Twitter is a widely publicized example of what they say doesn't scale. So every time we have a discussion with a new company that's considering Rails and trying to shoot it down, they say, well, what about Twitter? They failed. They tried to base their architecture on Rails and it didn't work. Here's the message for you, if anyone asks you about this or tells you about this. Twitter didn't scale initially, not because they were on Rails, but because they had a stupid architecture. It's true. They tried to make a database-backed website instead of making an asynchronous message queuing system. So now they're on Scala and all this other stuff. They're also using Rails still for their website. But what they've done now is they've created a sane architecture for Twitter. And guess what? You don't see this as often as you used to when you try to use Twitter, right? Now you see 503 service not there or whatever it is. That's not Twitter's fault, though. Dave Thomas said it best, I think. Twitter actually did the right thing. They created a service using Rails. They made it really, really quickly. They got it out there, and they're winning. I mean, it's amazing. It's just a service where you just type a message and put a piece of text out there. It's like a blog, but smaller. Why is it on CNN? Why are all these celebrities using Twitter to drive their stuff? Well, part of it is because they knew well enough to use a technology, though it might not be the right architecture for scaling big, it was the right architecture for getting it out there fast. So, you can criticize them, but kudos to them for what they did. Now, Ruby is slow. That's another thing they will say. And the answer to that is, of course it's slow. Yeah, it's really, really slow. But who cares, right? Because what percentage of the actual performance of, say, your web application is Ruby? And it looks something like this. Maybe you can't see it over there, but I'm saying that on the typical web request, Ruby is responsible for about 6% of the time taken. And I based this on whatever random small number I typed into Keynote when I made this slide. But it looks something like this. When you make a web request, though Ruby is definitely slow, if you benchmark Fibonacci against Ruby against C or Java or whatever, it's going to be slow. When you make a web request, your browser has to make a request over the network. It has to send data over the network. It has to then hit some sort of a web server, say Apache, something like that. Ruby is then brought into the mix, but what Ruby does is pretty quickly generate a SQL query for most web applications, and then send some data over the network to a database server, right? So then the database server goes and does all kinds of smart work, and it probably takes the largest amount of time. The database server has to do stuff like talk to your disks and actually dig up this data, query through it, and then return it back to Ruby. Ruby simply just formats something for display, and then all of this stuff is shoved out in huge strings over the network back to your browser, along with a bunch of JavaScript files and image files and all this other stuff. Ruby is just a small portion of that. So sure, it's slow, but big deal. Now they'll also say, we can't find developers that know this language. Or maybe these developers are expensive. That's also true. It's harder to find Ruby developers. They're right there. But we have experience at my company, InfoEther, replacing teams of 20 or more Java developers with 3 or 4 Ruby developers and going 5 times faster. We had one experience where there was a team of high-priced Java consultants working for 18 months on a project. They were going slower and slower and slower, and their site was performing worse and worse and worse. They brought us in. They were doing 6-week iterations, and that's bad anyway. That's not agile development, right? They were doing 6-week iterations. Our team of 4 people replaced their entire 18-month effort in 6 weeks and did the work that they were trying to do in a 6-week iteration. So in 6 weeks, we reset the entire project and caught up with what they had done in that 6 weeks. We probably cost a lot more per hour than those developers if you just measure it by the head. But it's quite clear that we didn't cost as much when you look at the actual total cost, because we did it all in 6 weeks. That's not even counting opportunity cost. So you can do more with these technologies more quickly. The other thing is, in a pioneer kind of environment like this, the developers that are working with these bleeding edge technologies are the ones that are better than the developers that are still content to sit there and hack away at whatever technology they've been told to use. Ruby is unsupportable also. And by unsupportable, the trolls mean there is no one that they can sign a contract with to support the guarantee that the software will work, right? This is the myth of support contracts. And what the myth of support contracts really means is that there is no one that the company can sue if it doesn't work. That's what they're really looking for. Because everybody with a brain knows that a support contract doesn't guarantee you anything. I have an example. I'll talk about them since they're pretty much dead anyway. Back in my old corporate IT world, I was trying to push for open source J2EE software. And the reason for that is we were running Netscape Application Server, which became iPlanet Application Server. Did anyone use that stuff? Couple? So Netscape Application Server, we spent I think it was for just our group, $100,000 a year just for support from Netscape. So that if we had a problem with Netscape application server, we could call Netscape and they would fix it. You know, it was like the gold support or platinum support, right? So I remember 4 incidents that we had with Netscape application server that were absolutely business critical systems, unaccessible, totally not working. Out of the 4 times that we contacted Netscape using our $100,000 a year support plan, Netscape solved the problem 0 times. 0. And that was after hours and hours and hours of goofing around with crap that they were telling us to do. What we did in almost all of the cases is we used a tool called JAD, which is a Java decompiler. We decompiled the Netscape application server source code. I didn't do it because it's illegal, but someone did. We found problems. We modified the application server and put our own patches in for it. We fixed the problems, and we told Netscape which lines of which files had the problem and what they were. Did the same exact thing with BEA WebLogic after we gave up on Netscape. So unsupportable is absolute BS. It's just not true. By comparison, and I wish I had these slides, but this is from another life, I did a study when I was at this large company on support in the Ruby world, and I used the Ruby Talk mailing list as an example. And what I did is I went through every single question that I could find in a 1-month period. It took me a long time. For each question, I then scanned through until I found the resolution, and I took the difference between the question and the answer time, you know, when the problem was solved. Not just when it was answered the first time, but when it was actually resolved. And I found that, on average, problems on the Ruby Talk mailing list back then were being solved within 1 hour, 30 minutes. Because there were people up all night just answering questions. And the standard deviation was really low too. So we had a very consistent, very good SLA. By comparison with the $100,000 support contract, we had an SLA that they would respond to us by the next day, with the first response, not with the resolution. And of course, they never solved any problems. So now Rails is just model view controller. That's another thing they'll say. We've already got MVC. We've got, you know, some .NET MVC framework, or we've got some Java MVC framework. And that's true. When Rails came out, I thought, well, this is just an MVC framework, and it's in Ruby. Nobody's going to want to use this. You know, I want to use Seaside or one of these continuation-based frameworks, or something that's innovative. Rails isn't innovative. It's just MVC. But it turns out that Rails is a whole lot more than just MVC. So you can just pretty much blow that argument away. And we'll talk about what those things are. Rails is insecure. Usually what they'll do there is they'll ask you the question, is it insecure? To which you'll have to say, I don't know, because you can't guarantee that it is. Security is one of those things people use to just stop you from being able to come up with a good answer. And so I'm not going to tell you that Rails is secure, because there may be some bug lurking in there. But having decompiled Netscape application server and BEA WebLogic, I can tell you it's probably not secure if Rails isn't. What Rails does have, because of some very visible mistakes that they've made, is a really solid process now for dealing with security issues. So if you look at some of the recent things that have happened and the way the Rails security team has responded, you'll be very impressed. Okay, this one I like a lot, and this one is actually kind of true, that Rails is for elite idealists. You can't use it for real-world stuff. You know, these people, David Hansen, not everyone can be a beautiful person that never has to work on a difficult problem. Just a few of us can be like that, right? And they're right. There are some things about Rails that are kind of elitist and kind of idealist, sometimes in a good way and sometimes in an inflexible, impractical way. For example, the way that you have to do testing in Rails with the test database. If you're on a team that's using Oracle all over the place, that might not work very well. Oracle shops really hate this. They say, you mean I actually have to install Oracle on all of the developers' computers and they have to have a license for it and you're going to blow it away every time you run the tests? Of course people have come up with ways to get around that, right? Because it's Ruby. You can change everything. That's part of the beauty of it. But the other thing is that you know, you obviously can use it for real-world stuff. I've been doing a project recently for a company that's trying to build an enterprise software component library for Rails, basically a way to bootstrap kind of the common enterprise stuff that you have to do. And I've been asking Rails to do task after task that is nothing that David Hansen would ever want it to do. But this is what this company wants to do, and they're doing great stuff. Every single time I have been amazed at how easy it was to make Rails do something it didn't want to do. They would say, now we want to do this crazy auditing piece. And I'd say, oh, God, that's going to take a long time. And then I would sit down for an hour, and it would kind of be working. And they'd say, wow, I thought you said it was going to take a long time. I said, hey, we're not using Java here. So another thing they'll ask is, well, but can it do X? Can it do this thing? And then you'll say yes, and they'll say, oh, but can it do this thing? And then they'll say yes, and then they'll just keep asking that over and over and over until they find the thing that you cannot do, and they'll say, aha, so we cannot use it. This is something that I used to do. I know this trick because in my job as head of application architecture for a large company, I used to negotiate with enterprise software vendors. So I can tell you exactly why enterprise software sucks so bad. It's because people like me ask this question over and over and over until they receive the answer no. Then the sales engineers from those enterprise software vendors go back to the product developers and they say, we can't sell the software, or they want to take 10% off the price because it can't do this thing. It can't talk to their custom mainframe with their own RDBMS system that they've written with a custom protocol over SNA. So then the product developers go back and they implement that, and they put a configuration thing in a configuration file, and they make the software so complicated that you might as well just write the software yourself as opposed to having to configure it. This is why enterprise software sucks so bad, because everyone asks this question all the time, usually in a negotiating situation. But whenever I wanted to not have to use a piece of software, for example, Broadvision, anyone ever heard of Broadvision? If you Google for it, you'll find a site called broadvisionsucks.com. That's about it. We had someone pushing us to use that when I was at this large company. And so I just asked this until they said no too many times, and I put together my list of things it couldn't do, and we killed that project. In that case, it was for a noble reason, though. Now, do we have to throw away our existing investment? We've got this huge .NET infrastructure. We've got this huge Java infrastructure. We're going to have to throw this away to use Ruby on Rails? Really? And the answer is no, not really. They will say that, but they can continue to drive around with their existing investment. Because we have JRuby, we have Iron Ruby coming up, almost 1.0. Of course, it's been almost 1.0 for a long time, but it's coming soon. You don't have to throw away your existing investment at all. You can use it. But the other thing is, maybe you should not be so homogeneous anyway. Heterogeneous systems work. There are some languages, some environments that are better for certain tasks than others. For example, have you ever written a batch processing system in Java? I have, and it really sucked. It was stupid. But I was doing it because the people at my company were using COBOL to do it before. And Java was, the coolest thing they would allow me to use, and I had to push for that. Amazon, if you look at the Amazon webpage, at least as of a couple of years ago, the front page would cause over 100 services to be called to render that one page. And the services are in a plethora of different technologies. That's because Amazon is smart enough to know that to move as quickly as they need to, they build an architecture where they can use the right tool for the job for each piece of their system. That's a smart strategy. Betting everything on one technology is not a smart strategy. Quite obvious when I say it that way, I'm sure. Another thing they might say, and they probably will, and you probably have to, is Rails is opinionated software, and we do not like its opinions. I don't want to name my stuff like this, or I don't want to put my models in app models, that's silly. Or functionals, what is that? These are not functional tests. There's all these kind of things that you can come up with about it that you hate. And I felt that way when it came out, and I thought, who is this punk from Denmark, this kid who has done like 6 months of Java development and a whole bunch of PHP sites? Who is he to tell me how to organize my project? He doesn't know better than me. What an arrogant little snot. And that's what they like to, they think this, right? But as I thought about it, I realized that the opinions that Rails has are not opinions about things that are important for the most part. Some of them are. But what do you name things? How do you structure your directories? How do you run your tests? That sort of thing. If you just let go of those opinions and let go of your ego about having control over every little stupid decision, you'll find that you're freed up to do the important stuff. You're freed up to think about the software you want to develop. I actually had a very influential conversation on IM once with Glenn Vanderberg, who's sitting right there, where Glenn had switched from doing Java consulting to Ruby consulting, and I said, hey, how's that going? He said, it's actually very stressful. And I said, why? That's strange. That's not what I was expecting. And he said, well, the problem with Ruby is when I was in Java, I would think of how I was going to solve a problem, and then there would be this period of time where I would sit and type, and I would do configuration files, and my brain could turn off while I implemented the solution. And with Ruby, and particularly Ruby on Rails, I'm filling in for him now, you come up with the solution, you just type it in, you're done. And now you have to think of the next solution. So your brain is on the whole time because you're not having to worry about all the crap that Rails has answered for you. That's very powerful. So finally, now there are lots of different techniques they'll use, but the worst one is that they will tell you, oh yeah, it's so much better, prove it. I don't know how you do that, right? I mean, you can't really measure, you can't do two projects in parallel with the exact same people solving the problem for the first time at the exact same time. It's impossible. So it's very, very difficult to measure. And the thing is, we had this problem with every technology and every methodology we've ever tried to introduce in our industry. So how do you prove it? Well, you can't really, depending on what kind of sticklers they're being, how specific they're being. With XP, at another large company, I was trying to do extreme programming, and they actually asked us to prove it, and we had the same issue. They said, well, you can actually even have two teams. We'll let you do that. The problem is it's not the same two teams, so you can't really compare velocity. All you can do is really measure the important stuff, and the important stuff is, how your customers felt as you were developing the solution, whether or not it saved you money, how hard it was to support, all kinds of things that are really difficult to measure. I don't really have a good solution for this one, but we'll talk about some options. So those are the FUD techniques they'll use. Now, as a kind of an aside, an interesting thing that Rails has done for us, and that this whole Ruby thing has done for us, is it has now made it okay to use weird technologies. Because in 2005, 2004, when Rails was still picking up steam, most people had never heard of Ruby. In fact, right before that, I worked for some big companies, and every time I mentioned the name Ruby, people would snicker, because they thought, you're just that weird Ruby guy that wants to use this weird language that you found on the weekend. But Rails has made it okay, so you start seeing more stuff like Haskell, Erlang, Clojure, Scala, stuff that you never would have heard someone talk about in a company before, right? It's starting to come to be. And another interesting point about weird is that whenever something is weird, it's almost always just part of some smaller set of normal. Just like these punk people, if you saw this picture with these people with mohawks, you would say, oh, punk people, right? They think they're being weird, but they're really just punk people. They're normal punk people with mohawks and kind of the typical punk way. So technologies aren't even really weird, right? Even if they are, though. This is Paul Graham. Paul Graham created the first e-commerce website. It was called VioWeb, and it was purchased by Yahoo. He wrote a wonderful essay that you all should read called Beating the Averages. And in Beating the Averages, he says, I'll just read this to you, the survival rate for startups is way less than 50%. So if you're running a startup, you had better be doing something odd. If not, you're in trouble. The average startup fails, dies. So in Beating the Averages, he talks about, for VioWeb, they used Lisp as the language. And this was back in the 90s, right? Lisp was definitely not mainstream. But he says that that is a large part of why they were successful, why they were able to go to market so quickly back then. The same thing is true now. If you use the average technology, you're going to have, usually, average performance. If you want above average performance, you do above average things. You do things that are not the norm. And Rails itself is not bleeding edge anymore. So you can actually bring this up. Is a 5-year-old technology bleeding edge in your book? If you're talking to someone who thinks it is, then you're probably working in the wrong place, right? Technology moves quickly. Ruby is older than Java. It's not bleeding edge. So with all of these things mounting against you, trying to stop you from doing the right thing, from doing the crap that you know is wrong, what can you do? So I'm going to give you some ideas. I've been doing this kind of insurgency basically for my entire career, because I'm always the guy who finds something better in my company that I want to do and push for it. Until now, I work for a company that does the right thing, because we're all those kind of person. But one piece of advice is don't try to just slam it in. You know, it's okay to try and get your way eventually, but do it gradually. This is important for 2 reasons. One, if you try to do a mass adoption of Rails or XP or whatever it may be, you're going to shock your customers and the people that you're supporting, the stakeholders, and you are going to make a mess. When you make a mess, they're going to blame it on whatever you're trying to do. So you need to minimize the impact initially. You also need to learn from your own mistakes. So it's best to make mistakes in small ways. So do it for yourself as well. Otherwise, you may find that you yourself come away hating the technology or the methodology that you're trying to promote. Look for things that the guards are not guarding. And this is actually one of the things that Andy talked about back in 2001. You know, maybe your e-commerce website or your company, you know, your customer-facing website is something that the guardians are really worried about. Or anything that touches your enterprise data, you know, the huge asset of important things. That's the sort of stuff that guardians like to guard. They don't care so much about stuff like little scripts here and there or unimportant applications. Perl, for example, no one used that back, say, in the early 90s. People like us were trying to get people to use it. So what did we do? Well, we found little CGI scripts that we could write. And we just say, that's just a little CGI script. And eventually, of course, it was mission critical. And you know, everyone was using it in the company. And you could say, hey, guess what? This mission critical thing is running on Perl. And it's been running for years, so we're okay. There are some places where these less important pieces of technology are going to be running on tools that the enterprise trolls don't approve of anyway. Maybe it's Cold Fusion, maybe it's PHP, maybe now it's Perl, Visual Basic. Find some technology that's currently in use, even if it's for something that you don't think is exactly the right fit for what you're trying to do, and see if you can come up with a better solution using the thing you know is right. Because the enterprise trolls will be happy to get rid of PHP if you can replace it with a nice object-oriented MVC framework with the shared nothing architecture and all these nice enterprise buzzwords, as long as you don't try to pit it against something like J2EE. One that I love is you can start using Ruby and Rails as a case tool. What is that? Computer-aided software engineering is what that stands for. That's kind of out of fashion now, so younger people might not even know what it means, right? But imagine you're sitting in a conversation with a business client or customer, and they're describing their system, and you're starting to extract the nouns of the system and the relationships from them. You're talking to them about, you know, there's going to be this object here that talks to that, maybe coming up with the ER diagram, that sort of thing. One of the things that we like to do in my company is have those conversations, and while we're having them, we will be typing models in to our editor, active record models. And as we discover the relationships between things, we'll type belongs to and has many and all those sorts of things, and we'll basically model out the entire system as we're having the discussion without really drawing attention to the fact that we're programming. It's really just note-taking, right? Active record is so succinct that you really can use active record to take notes. And what's awesome is, after you've done that, you have a couple of options. One is you could run scaffolding or something and actually, you know, bring up the website and show it to them. But for maybe a less flashy example, you could use something like Railroad. What Railroad does is it reads your active record models, it reflects on them, and it generates a diagram that looks like this for you. So I have a one-liner script that I'll run in my Rails application that renders a diagram as a PDF and then pops it open on my screen. So we'll be talking to a customer, and then you can just run this application, turn the laptop around and say, so this is what you mean. And they'll say, wow, that's great. Yeah, that's exactly what I mean. So then you can say, okay, cool, I've already implemented this code in Ruby. I can redo it for you if you want. In Java, it'll take 3 weeks. There is actually a system that inspires this kind of thinking. It's called Naked Objects. Have any of you used it? 1 out of all of you has used it. 2. So Naked Objects is really neat. It's a system in Java for creating hideous, ugly UIs automatically based on domain models. I can't imagine actually being a user that has to use a system created this way, but here's what was neat about Naked Objects, and it still exists for people who are interested. Naked Objects was not just a technical framework, but it was actually kind of a process that the creators of Naked Objects came up with. And the process was about how to interact in real time with your customers while you're writing code. So to do a naked object system, the way that you would do it if you adhered to this is you would sit down at a computer, kind of like pair programming with your customer. They would describe the system to you, and as they described it, you would type in models. And basically, it's just models and relationships. It's a lot like what you do with Active Record, except there's a lot more boilerplate because it's not Ruby code. And then you would say, is this it? And you would pop open this GUI, the swing GUI, that actually was the system. Maybe minus some of the bells and whistles, but it really was the running system that you were going to deliver to them. And you would work like this, say, all day with a customer, until you got to a point where they asked for something that would take longer than would be satisfactory to sit through. And then you would say, why don't you go get me a cup of coffee? Because that's how you treat your customers, right? Go get me a cup of coffee. When you come back, I'll show you this feature, or we'll take a lunch break or whatever. And so you basically just interact with them one-on-one all day, writing code, showing it to them, and at the end of the day, you have the real working application. Rails could be used that way too, especially if you remove even more of the cruft. Code your own conventions in. You can also use Ruby for scripting. It's a scripting language. Testing. Back in RubyConf 2001, we had a lunchtime conversation, like an organized, I don't want to say birds of a feather, but a session where people got together to talk about how we could best get Ruby in use in companies. And we had Brian Merrick there, who had testing.com, and again is one of the Agile Manifesto authors, but really into agile testing. And we all agreed that testing would be the great way to do it because the enterprise trolls don't care about testing at all. They want someone to do it, but that's all they want to know, is that there's a team that's doing testing, right? So it turns out then, because of really that initial discussion, that was the seed for stuff like Water and Selenium, but you can also use Ruby to do things like test C++ components, because it has a lovely C API. You could use it to test .NET applications because of Iron Ruby or Ruby.NET. You could use it to test Java applications because JRuby is very mature and a wonderful piece of software. So this is a great way to do it. No one's watching the testing framework. If you even automate it, you're doing better than most teams. So using Ruby won't be something that they scrutinize. Now, one of my favorite ways to use Ruby is to use it to generate code. The last time I worked for a huge company, I used Ruby to generate code in whatever language was okay to use back then, because no one really cared how I typed the code in as long as it came out in Java or it came out in C or whatever programming language I was supposed to use. And I knew that if I were using Ruby, I could do it faster. So there are a few different techniques you can use. One is ERB, which is the templating language you use by default in Rails, is actually not a Rails thing. Most people don't actually know this that are using Rails today. ERB has been around with Ruby for years and years and years. So you could create any text file you want with ERB tags. And here's just a lame example of generating some Java code. And then there's actually an ERB command line program. So it reads from standard in, and then it spits out something that it processes it. And there's actually a whole book about using ERB for this kind of code generation in a Java environment. It's dated, but it might still be worth looking at. It came out in 2003, and it's called Code Generation in Action. And Jack Harrington uses Ruby for all of the examples with ERB. Another thing might be to use something like Dr. Nick's RubyGen to create a framework for generating components. So what Dr. Nick did is he extracted the generator from Rails, that software. He made a separate gem that doesn't depend on Rails, and you can use it to create any kind of generator you want. And this is a really nice system because it uses a manifest you can destroy and create, and all the nice things you can do with Rails. So if you have standards in your project, say your Java or your .NET project for how you set things up, maybe you have a set of 10 components of different types that you need to create every time you want to do any feature, because that's the way life is when you use those technologies. Use something like RubyGen and make yourself a generator. And then finally, for code generation, you can do something like this. Now, it doesn't matter if you can't read this whole thing. This is something that Rich Kilmer and I did 6 years ago, where we have a DSL, a domain-specific language. We were trying to implement the Java debug wire protocol in Ruby so that we could talk to JVMs as if we were a debugger and do things like halt them, restart them, explore the threads and the objects and that sort of thing. And so rather than type in all of the nasty little code that you would need to implement that with binary pack and unpack, really Rich did this. We were looking at the spec on Sun's website. And the spec had basically a bunch of tables. There were nested tables, and they would say there was a command set called virtual machine. It was command set 1. There was a command inside of it called version. The description of the command was such and such, and then it had data that you would pass in, reply data that would come out, what the errors might be, that sort of thing. So the first thing we tried to do was just parse that HTML file and generate the code from it. But it turned out the HTML file was sort of messy, so we couldn't. So instead, we just copied and pasted the entire HTML into Ruby and then rearranged it such that it was executable Ruby code. From this, we can then compile this DSL, it's a long, long document, into Ruby code that's executable. And that was like a 5,500 line bunch of Ruby code that's binary packs and unpacks and things you don't want to have to type yourself. Someone came along later after this project was released, and they used it to generate scheme code. So there's no reason you couldn't do something like this and generate Java code. I have another project where we were being forced to support PHP, and we had a bunch of kind of repetitive tasks going on in PHP. There wasn't really a good abstraction in PHP for implementing these tasks. So instead, we made a nice block-based Ruby API that we could configure. We could show it to the customer, they could understand it. And it was 5 lines long. We would run it through a Ruby script, and it would generate pages and pages of PHP and do the work for us. So that's a way to get Ruby in that almost no one's going to argue with. The other thing you can do is you can work on throwaway apps with Ruby. It's something that no one cares about, because throwaway apps don't usually get thrown away. So that's kind of sneaky. Maybe this is the, hey, what are we going to have for lunch application? This is actually how we got Zope in at a company that I was at many, many years ago. For those of you who know what Zope is, I actually made the what are we going to have for lunch application, and then I shared it with a bunch of different teams, and they all started using it. Then the CIO started using it, and at that point, he found out it was Zope, and we started using Zope for everything because he saw how fast I did it. You might also automate deployment with Ruby. Capistrano is not just for Rails. When I worked for yet another huge company, we used to have daydream sessions about how we wished we could deploy our .NET applications. And we went through all these different scenarios of how we would roll back and forward and how we would use version control. And then when Capistrano came along, I recognized that from our dreams. And I said, Jameis, how did you know? But Capistrano kicks the butt of just about every single deployment solution I've ever seen. And it probably is much better than what you're using today. So another case is just do a prototype. Do a spike, as they say in the agile world. Because again, people don't mind so much if you make a prototype in something that they don't want to use, because the idea is you throw it away. What they will discover, though, is you could make a prototype with 100% test coverage and really good automated deployment so fast that it would take, maybe, let's say, 10 times as long to get the same thing going in the technology you're using today. And when they ask about it, you can say, well, we could throw this away, or we could just deploy it. In fact, it's already deployed, and if you want to change something, we just change it here, and we run cat deploy, and there it goes. So with Rails, you can do a prototype where the automation and the design and everything might even be better than what you're going to create in the production architecture that you create. So that's another good technique. You might also try doing an application where it's just the user interface. Because the enterprise trolls, they're guarding the important pieces of the software, and they tend to devalue the user interface. They like EJBs and message queuing systems and Oracle databases and big iron. So tell them, we're just going to do the UI in Rails, and then we're going to talk to your big enterprise system to do the heavy lifting. And you'll find that people will sometimes be amenable to that. You could also say, hey, let's use a service-oriented architecture, SOA. And they'll say, ooh, I love SOA. That's a great idea. And you might just take, instead of reskinning the application with Rails, you can also use a technique where you just do one vertical chunk of the application with Rails. It's an easy way to step in. And again, maybe it's a less important part of a system that you're already working on. We did a registration system for a company this way, just new user signups. It would have taken them a month, and instead it took us, let's say, not a month, but I'll tell you that that's not true. But you could do it really quickly. One technique for doing that is to use something like edge side includes, ESI. And not a lot of people have heard of this, but it's a great way of compositing applications, and you can sell it to them because Oracle has Oracle Web Cache, which supports ESI. So it allows you to very easily have a chunk, even a fragment of HTML being rendered from an application over here running Ruby, while you have Java fronting the whole thing and .NET over here, and it's a great way to put in a heterogeneous system. So let's say you actually get some success and you're able to do a project in Rails. Just a few quick things. Be very specific about the goals of the project and make them measurable if you can. Don't let them be about Ruby. And I would say don't share with as few people as possible that you're using Ruby or you're using Rails or you're using agile development, whatever it happens to be that you're trying to do. The reason for this is because, as I said, if you make a big sound about the fact that we're going to try out this new technology, you will find that every single problem that comes up gets attracted to Ruby or attracted to Rails like it's a lightning rod. And the farther away from the technology organization that this information is shared, the more likely people are going to start throwing this around. We did an LDAP adoption at one of the companies I worked for before, and we had, like VP of sales yelling about how LDAP sucked in a meeting once. I thought, lightweight directory access protocol sucks, really? You're the VP of sales. Why do you even know what that is? But it was because someone had incorrectly sold the benefits of switching to a technology like this. So you choose these measurements that actually make sense to business people. It's probably like project velocity if you have anything like that in place. And then report on those metrics. Steer the conversation toward measurable things. Take the emotion out of it. Even though you probably are emotional about trying to get your thing adopted, remove the emotion from the process whenever you can in business. And avoid the following ideas, the following things. One of them is, if you can avoid rewriting all of your software and replacing it in one big thud, please do. And I could probably talk all day about this idea of the big rewrite. There are so many ways that this can fail you. Avoid it at all costs. If you want to learn more about this, Google for the big rewrite, and you'll find my website. I did a series of articles because my career has been plagued with having to rewrite enterprise software over and over and over again in new technologies, and I've made every possible mistake. Don't do the old technology in Ruby syntax. That will be very tempting. Some of you are nodding because you've already done this or you've seen other people do it. You can make a really, really bad enterprise-y piece of software in Rails if you approach it like it's a .NET project. And you say, well, let me do it like this. I know this is how we structure things on our team, even though it's not how we do it in the Rails way. So if you're going to switch technologies, the reason you wanted to switch in the first place is to do things differently. Let yourself do things differently. Don't do something like look at Ruby and say, wow, I wish it had optional static typing. That would make it really good, because I have that in C#. Because guess what? You can build something in Ruby that makes it look like it has optional static typing. You can spend a long time doing that. And then if you do, you will know Ruby well enough by the end of it that you will throw that away and never use it again. So do that for fun, but don't use it on your project. I think the biggest reason, though, that Rails adoptions fail is because processes fail. And that's kind of obvious because that's the biggest reason that anything fails, really anywhere, right? Processes fail. Specifically with Rails, though, what we have encountered is that when we're doing Rails work for a company that's not used to Rails, we move so quickly that they can't keep up with us. So this user registration project I was talking about, this simple little piece of an application that we were going to do, Rich and I worked on this together. We probably could have finished this thing in, I don't know, 3 days. It was pretty complicated. It had, multiple states of registration and going off to third-party services to verify people, that sort of thing. We probably could have done it in 3 days, but we got stuck in a bunch of Scrum meetings. Process crap. And instead it took us, a month and a half, right? A month and a half to do what we probably could have done in 3 days. So we didn't get the benefit that we expected from Rails, and therefore the company that we were working with didn't get the benefit that they expected from Rails. And we pushed back and pushed back and pushed back. But in the end, you can't make things go fast if the people that you're working with won't allow you to go fast. We had another experience recently where we had a customer that had a huge project that they had sent out for proposals to offshore teams. They had gotten these massive number of hours back. We underbid all of the competition by something like 50%. We ended up going so fast that instead of doing the project that we were expecting to do, we did something that was maybe a quarter of what they expected in terms of the money that we would be paid, because they couldn't keep up with us. They couldn't actually figure out what the system should do from a business perspective fast enough to keep up with the implementation. And that kind of sounds like a good story, but for us it was not very good because we were out of work when we expected to be working on something. So beware of that. CD Baby is probably the most visible historical failure to implement Rails. I think they worked for 2 years to rewrite CD Baby in Rails. And at this URL here, 7 reasons I switched back to PHP after 2 years on Rails. The founder of CD Baby describes all of the reasons he switched back to PHP. Go read it. The key message there is that it's not all negative. And I'll give you one example. So maybe the insurgency fails. What are the alternatives? Well, one is to do Rails without actually using Rails or even Ruby. What is Rails? To me, actually, let me skip this real quick. This is the key to Rails. It's an MVC framework, yeah, whatever. We've all got MVC frameworks. But Rails is about taking crap that you shouldn't have to do out of the process of software development. And if you all think about whatever you were using before Rails or whatever you're using today, you are doing a lot of crap that you don't have to do, even in that environment. You can automate stuff. You can stop having meetings about how you're going to set up your test automation and just pick one way and do it. You can create your own conventions. You can auto-generate code. And you can do all of that and gain those benefits without actually using Rails. And this is one of the quotes from Derek Sivers of CD Baby from the article I was talking about. Programming languages are like girlfriends. The new one is better because you are better. And if you are here and you understand how Rails is better than what you were doing before, your old technology can serve you just as well. In the end, regardless of how you do it, if your insurgency is successful, everybody wins. You win, your customers win. You do it because you know it's the right thing to do, because you know you're wasting money, you're wasting their time, you're hurting your customers the way you're doing things now. If your insurgency is not successful, and you choose the alternative of following the Rails practices without actually switching to Rails, everybody wins. Regardless, everybody wins. So, obrigado.